For 87 years, Vise-Grip made one of the most trusted locking pliers in America, right here in DeWitt, Nebraska, a town of fewer than 600 people. The tool never failed. The factory never shut down. Sales never collapsed. And then one morning in 2008, a corporation in Atlanta, Georgia, decided to close it anyway. 300 workers lost their jobs. Not because the product was bad, not because the company was broke, because a spreadsheet said it would be cheaper to make the same tool in China. The name Vise-Grip survived. The factory did not. The town did not. If you have ever locked a pair of Vise-Grips onto a rusted bolt with both hands and felt it hold, this story is about the people who made that possible, and about the one decision that ended everything they built. Before we go any further, you need to know how this story ends. Today, Vise-Grip locking pliers are manufactured in China. They are sold under the Irwin brand, which is owned by Stanley Black and Decker, a corporation that also owns Craftsman, DeWitt, Mac Tools, and dozens of other American tool names you grew up trusting. The DeWitt factory is still standing. The building did not fall down. No fire took it. No flood destroyed it. It simply sits there, windows intact, parking lot cracked and empty, the loading docks sealed shut. Understanding how that happened requires going back to the beginning, not to the corporation, not to the acquisition, but back to a blacksmith in Nebraska, working alone, trying to solve a problem that nobody else had solved yet. William Peterson was 31 years old in 1921. He had spent the previous decade working as a blacksmith and auto mechanic in DeWitt, Nebraska, fixing farm equipment, repairing engines, doing the kind of work that only gets done when someone already knows what is broken and has the hands to fix it. That year, working alone in his shop on the main street of DeWitt, he designed a new kind of plier, one that could lock onto a surface and hold with adjustable compound leverage without any hands on it. When the handles were squeezed past a certain point, the jaw locked. It would not release until you deliberately broke the lock. The tool held by itself, without hands, without effort, without giving way. He called it the Vise-Grip. He built the first ones himself by hand in DeWitt. He did not build a factory right away. He built a tool. He made it work. He sold it to the mechanics and farmers around him, and they told other mechanics and other farmers, and slowly the orders began to come from farther away. By the 1930s, Peterson Manufacturing was a real company in a real building, still in DeWitt, still run by the man who invented the tool. The Great Depression hit Nebraska hard. Farms failed, banks closed. Small businesses across the Midwest disappeared. Peterson Manufacturing survived because the tool was good enough and useful enough and trusted enough that people found a way to keep buying it even when they had almost nothing left to spend. That kind of survival does not happen by accident. It happens because the product earns it. If you had stood on the factory floor in DeWitt in the 1950s or the 1960s, this is what you would have experienced. The smell of cutting oil, sharp and metallic, settled into everything. The walls, the floors, the workers' clothes, the air itself. The sound of punch presses running in rhythm filled the building from one end to the other. A steady mechanical heartbeat that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. The floor was concrete, stained dark from decades of oil and metal shavings. The light came from industrial fixtures hung from the ceiling, casting everything in that yellow-white glow that anyone who has ever worked a factory shift knows by memory. There were more than 300 workers on a full shift. Many of them had started young, teenagers hired for their first real job in DeWitt, learning the machines under the supervision of older workers who had learned under workers older still. By the time a man had been on the line for 10 years, he knew the equipment by sound. He could hear when something was slightly off before any instrument confirmed it. Every pair of vice grips was assembled, adjusted, tested, and inspected before it left the building. Workers checked jaw alignment, screw tension, and locking force. The tool had to hold under real pressure. If it did not hold in the DeWitt factory, it did not ship. At the end of each shift, a finished vice grip passed through the hands of an inspector. The tool had weight to it, not the hollow lightness of something made to a price, but the dense, solid feel of machined steel fit together correctly. You could feel the jaw tension in your palm. You could hear the click of the adjustment screw seating properly. A tool that passed inspection felt right before anyone measured it. 2 shifts ran every weekday. The morning shift started before the sun came up. The parking lot filled in the dark and emptied after dark. The same workers in the same parking lot in DeWitt, Nebraska, year after year for more than 4 decades. Some of them had fathers who had worked the same shifts in the same building before them. The factory was not a part of the town. The factory was the town. By 1965, Peterson Manufacturing was producing millions of vice grip units annually, shipping to distributors in all 48 contiguous states. The factory ran on 2 shifts, 6 days a week, 48 weeks a year. By the 1960s and the 1970s, vice grip had become something that very few manufactured products ever become, a proper noun that replaced the generic term entirely. Mechanics did not ask for locking pliers. They asked for vice grips. The brand name had become the object. In the same way people ask for a Band-Aid instead of an adhesive bandage, tradesmen across the country reached for a vice grip the way they reached for air. The United States military used them. Aerospace maintenance crews servicing aircraft in hangars from California to Virginia used them. Automotive technicians, plumbers, electricians, farmers, and construction workers all used them. Any trade that involved mechanical work in any form had vice grips in the toolbox. The design changed very little over 50 years. There was no reason to change it. A locking plier that works is a locking plier that works. Peterson Manufacturing added sizes and specialized jaw shapes, but the core mechanism stayed essentially identical to what William Peterson had designed in his shop in 1921. That core mechanism included the over-center lock, the adjustable jaw, and the compound leverage. When a product barely changes for 50 years, it is not because the company lacks imagination. It is because the product is right. In 1987, Peterson Manufacturing was acquired by American Tool Companies, a Nebraska-based conglomerate that produced and distributed hand tools across the United States. This was the first transfer of ownership since William Peterson had founded the company. Production stayed in DeWitt. The workers stayed. The brand identity stayed. From the outside, almost nothing appeared to change, but something had changed. The company was no longer controlled by the family of the man who built the tool. It was now an asset inside a portfolio, evaluated not solely on the quality of what it made, but on what it returned to the people who now owned it. That distinction sounds small. It is not small. It is everything. William Peterson did not live to see what became of the company he built. He had spent more than 4 decades developing, manufacturing, and refining the vice grip in DeWitt, growing it from a one-man shop into a factory that employed hundreds of his neighbors. By the time the acquisition papers were signed in 1987, the Peterson family was no longer in control of the tool that carried their name. The brand survived. The founder did not live long enough to understand what that would eventually mean. There is a particular kind of tragedy in building something with your hands that outlasts you, and watching, from whatever distance the dead can watch, as the people who inherited it decide it is worth more as a cost reduction than as a promise. In the late 1990s, American Tool Companies was acquired by Rubbermaid Incorporated, a large American consumer products company based in Wooster, Ohio. Shortly after, Rubbermaid merged with Newell Company to form Newell Rubbermaid, one of the largest consumer goods corporations in the United States, headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. By the time Newell Rubbermaid completed the acquisition chain, the company managed more than 90 brands across 30 product categories. Their stated goal was to cut operating costs by at least 15% across every acquired business within the first 3 years of ownership. Their strategy was not secret. It was their stated operating model. It had worked reliably across dozens of product categories before Vise-Grip. Acquire a brand with strong consumer recognition, reduce production costs, consolidate manufacturing, move what can be moved overseas, extract profit from the reputation the original builders spent decades earning. For a tool manufactured in a small Nebraska town by workers earning American wages, that strategy meant one thing with perfect clarity. The factory in DeWitt was a cost problem that needed to be solved. Chinese manufacturing costs for comparable hand tools had fallen dramatically through the 1990s and into the 2000s. A locking plier that cost a certain amount to produce in DeWitt, Nebraska, could be produced for a fraction of that cost in a manufacturing facility in Shenzhen or Ningbo. The tool would look nearly identical. The packaging would look nearly identical. Most consumers, picking a tool off a shelf at a hardware store in Ohio or Texas or Georgia, would not immediately know the difference. The numbers were not complicated. The decision that followed from those numbers was not complicated either. Inside the DeWitt factory in the early 2000s, something had shifted in the air. Workers noticed that management conversations had changed. Production targets were still being met. Orders were still being filled. The machines were still running. But the questions being asked by corporate representatives during their visits from Atlanta were no longer about output and quality. They were about cost per unit, about overhead per square foot, about what the DeWitt facility required to remain operational year after year. Several longtime supervisors later described the atmosphere of those years as one of quiet dread. They did not know the exact timeline. They did not know the final decision had already been entered into spreadsheets they would never see, in offices they would never visit. But they knew, in the way that people who have worked a place for 30 years learn to read a room, that something was coming. Some workers accelerated their retirement plans. Some started looking for other jobs in Crete or Beatrice or Lincoln, which was difficult because DeWitt and the surrounding towns had very little else to offer a man who had spent his career running a punch press. Some simply kept their heads down and kept working because the work was still there, and hope is a hard thing to surrender when you have built your life around a place. In 2008, Newell Rubbermaid announced that the DeWitt, Nebraska manufacturing facility would be permanently closed. Production of Vise-Grip locking pliers would be transferred to a manufacturing facility in Shenzhen, China. The announcement came in the same year that the American financial system was collapsing. Unemployment was rising across every state. Auto plants in Michigan and Ohio were closing their gates. The Midwest was losing manufacturing jobs at a rate not seen since the early 1980s. More than 300 workers in DeWitt, Nebraska, received notice that their jobs would end. This was not a company that had failed. Vise-Grip was still selling. The brand was still trusted. There was no quality crisis, no market collapse, no new technology that had made the locking plier obsolete. The tool was still needed. The workers in DeWitt were still fully capable of building it. The factory closed because it was cheaper to build the tool in China. That was the complete explanation. There was no other reason. We did not lose this factory to a better competitor. We did not lose it to a better product. We did not lose it to the market. We lost it to a cost reduction decision made in a corporate office in Atlanta, 1,200 miles from the people it destroyed. DeWitt, Nebraska had fewer than 600 residents when the factory closed. The average worker at the DeWitt factory had been on the line for 14 years at the time of the closure announcement. Some had been there for 25. A handful had put in more than 30 years. The youngest workers on the floor were in their late 20s. The oldest were 62. With more than 300 jobs eliminated in a town that size, you are not talking about an economic setback. You are talking about the removal of the economic foundation of an entire community. Every household in DeWitt was connected to that factory, directly through employment or indirectly through the businesses and services that existed because factory workers needed them. The diner on Main Street in DeWitt had served breakfast to factory workers on the early shift for decades. The hardware store on the main block had supplied the factory with small parts and supplies, and supplied factory workers with what they needed at home. The local school enrollment had depended on young families staying in town because the factory gave them a reason to stay. Within 2 years of the plant closure, the diner was closed. Several other small businesses that had defined DeWitt's commercial center were gone shortly after. The workers who had spent 20, 25, or 30 years on the factory floor did not find comparable employment in the region. There was no comparable employer within a reasonable driving distance from DeWitt. Severance packages were paid. They were not generous enough to replace a career. Some workers were in their mid-50s when the factory closed, too young to retire on what they had saved, too far from any city to easily find equivalent work, too old in the eyes of most employers to be worth training for something new. These were not abstract economic casualties. These were people who had given their working lives to building a tool that American tradesmen trusted, and who received, in exchange, a notice, a check, and a town that no longer had a reason to stay alive. The final weeks of production inside the DeWitt factory were described by workers as deeply strange. The machines were still running, orders were still being filled, but everything that was not essential to final production had already been tagged and cataloged for removal. The conversations on the floor had changed completely. No longer about product, no longer about process, but about what came next. For most of the workers standing at those machines in DeWitt, Nebraska, in the fall of 2008, what came next was an unanswered question. Some workers brought cameras in the final days. They photographed the machines they had run for decades. They photographed each other standing at their stations. They photographed the factory floor in DeWitt from angles they had never thought to record when they assumed they would be back on Monday. Some took small pieces of scrap steel from the shop floor on the last day. They did not take them to steal anything of value. They took them to hold something physical from a place that had defined the shape of their adult lives. On the last day of production, the parking lot outside the DeWitt Vise-Grip factory, the lot that had filled before sunrise every working day for 87 years, was empty by mid-morning. The factory did not explode. It did not burn. It did not collapse. It simply stopped. One day it was running. The next day it was not. After production moved to China, professional tradesmen and longtime Vise-Grip users began noting differences in the tool. Online mechanic communities, professional tool forums, and trade groups accumulated accounts from experienced users describing changes in jaw precision, screw adjustment consistency, and the feel of the locking mechanism in newer production. Vise-Grips compared to older American-made units. The fundamental design had not changed. The tool still locked. It still worked. For most users, most of the time, it performed adequately. But the consistency was different. The tolerance, the degree to which each manufactured unit matched every other, was different in ways that experienced hands could feel. Mechanics who had used Vise-Grips professionally for 20 or 30 years began recommending that other tradesmen seek out older American-made units at estate sales tool swaps, and flea markets across the Midwest. This is not nostalgia. This is professional assessment from people whose livelihoods depend on their tools performing correctly. When a tradesman tells you to find the old version of something, he is not being sentimental. He is telling you that the new version is not the same thing. In 2016, Stanley Black & Decker acquired the Irwin Tools brand portfolio, including Vise-Grip from Newell Brands, for approximately $1.95 billion. The brand that William Peterson built in a Nebraska blacksmith shop in 1921 is now managed from corporate offices in New Britain, Connecticut, alongside Craftsman, DeWitt, Mac Tools, and the long list of American tool names that Stanley Black & Decker has assembled over the past 2 decades. In 2023 and 2024, Stanley Black & Decker announced a series of restructuring moves affecting thousands of employees across their global operations, including further consolidation of their hand tool manufacturing supply chain. The company reported ongoing pressure to reduce costs across their tool divisions, the same pressure that ended the DeWitt factory 15 years earlier, and that is still working its way through every brand they own. For the people of DeWitt, Nebraska, none of those announcements mentioned their town. None of them ever do. As of 2025, Vise-Grip locking pliers are still manufactured in China. The factory in DeWitt is still empty. There are no announced plans to bring the work back. The brand is still profitable. The name is still recognized. The tool still sells. None of that changes what was lost, or who lost it. Stand at the edge of DeWitt, Nebraska. Close your eyes. It is 6 in the morning. The air smells of cutting oil and early winter. You can hear the punch presses starting up inside the factory building a block away. That steady mechanical rhythm that this town fell asleep to and woke up to for 87 years. The parking lot is filling. Workers in work boots and canvas jackets are crossing the lot in the dark, lunch pails in hand, heading toward the same entrance they have walked through 5 days a week since they were young enough to need the work. They do not think of themselves as making history. They think of themselves as going to work. They are making something real, a tool that will end up in a garage in Ohio, a farm shop in Kansas, an auto bay in Georgia, in the hands of someone who will use it without knowing their names, without knowing this town exists, without understanding that the reason the tool holds is because these particular people, in this particular town in Nebraska, cared enough to build it right. Open your eyes. The factory is still there. The building is intact. The loading docks are sealed. The parking lot is cracked and empty. The sign is gone. The diner is closed. The hardware store is closed. The school is smaller than it was. Main Street in DeWitt is quieter than a street should be. The Vise-Grip is still on the shelf at the hardware store 40 miles away. The packaging is almost the same. The name is the same. William Peterson built a tool in this town that held things together that would not otherwise hold. There is nothing holding this town together anymore. And somewhere in an Atlanta boardroom in 2008, someone looked at the numbers and called that acceptable.